everyone, and welcome to Learning with Belvista Studios. I am so excited today to have Stella Collins on an episode. Stella is super inspiring for me. I met her over in London, and she does a lot of work around neuroscience in learning and development. So she is known as the brain-friendly learning professional. She's an author, she's a keynote speaker, the brain lady, and she's also a consultant. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, Stella. I am really looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you, Hannah. It's nice to see you again.
Definitely. So I guess the first question is, what is neuroscience? Oh
my God, that's a massive question.
This could go in so many directions. How can you make it simple for people to understand what neuroscience is?
The way I define neuroscience is it's the study of the brain and the body, the nervous system, and how that works. Some people define it very precisely or more precisely and define it as sort of the mechanics of how the brain works. I use the mechanics, but I also use the psychology. I also like to think about some of the things that we are learning and constantly learning from sort of artificial intelligence and thinking about brains from different angles. So I have quite a broad definition of neuroscience, and I would say it's anything to do with understanding how the brain works and how we behave as humans.
Love it.
And I relate that to learning, obviously, because that's my field of interest.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great answer. So why do you think neuroscience is important for learning and development? So learning and development practitioners out there, why should they be considering neuroscience?
Because for me, if you are a learning and development practitioner, what you're trying to do is you're trying to mess with people's brains. You're trying to change, their attitudes, their knowledge, their behaviors, and all of that is effectively working with their brains. So for me, it's about understanding the tool you're working with better. So the more you understand about it, and I don't think everybody needs to be a neuroscientist, I'll come to that in a minute, but I think the more you understand about how brains learn and the different ways of learning, because there's multiple different ways of learning, multiple different things we learn, the more you understand about it, the better you can adapt, tweak, design, deliver, and kind of create an environment that makes learning happen more easily. Whereas if you don't understand, it's like a really good driver usually knows how a car works, because if you know how a car works, then you know when to accelerate, when to brake, when to do. I'm not an expert driver, but by understanding how a car works, you can drive it better. By understanding how a brain works, I believe we can train better.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally get that. Like, it's so true when we're teaching people and we're helping people be better, and our brain is like the most important thing, really. Like, it helps us do everything, so it just makes so much sense. So
yeah. It's about seeing that brain in the bigger context as well, Hannah. So it's the brain is just kind of in your head, but obviously it affects your whole body, but your whole body affects your brain too. So I think for me it's also important to think about what's the physiological context in which we're learning. So we learn better when we're in a good physiological state as well as a good sort of psychological state.
That's so interesting. So tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? As in mood or?
Yeah, mood, physical health. If you're an active, so for instance, there's a lot of evidence to show that exercise helps to stimulate brain cell growth, particularly in the hippocampus, which is where we process memory. So if exercising helps you grow brain cells, then it makes sense to exercise, and that people who exercise are more likely, this is massively generalized, of course, but they are more likely to have a healthier brain and body, which then all fits together.
Wow, that's so cool. I actually feel like I've experienced that. If I have something on during the day that's going to be challenging for my mind, if I exercise in the morning, I know I'm going to be much more equipped. Like, I didn't know if it was just like something in my head, but I think you're right. Like, you do feel like more clear and able to, take on challenges. So
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
And also exercise does things like, it increases your blood rate, your pulse rate, it increases the amount of oxygen that goes around your body. So it's not just the brain growth it's helping, but it's actually helping your whole body work better, which helps your brain work better. And, when you're feeling healthy, when you're feeling good, just everything works better, doesn't it? And, right now people are really challenged because there's a lot of people are highly stressed at the moment. And stress is really poor for learning. Stress really, reduces our ability to learn. So whilst there's loads and loads of stuff out there at the moment saying, learn this, learn that, you haven't got to go to work, you're not busy. Not sure who isn't busy, but, so there are people who are busy. Actually, it may not be a good time for people to learn right now because they may actually be too stressed to actually go and introduce themselves to something completely new.
Yeah. So that's interesting. If, say, you had like a group of people come into a training course that you were doing and you're wanting to teach them something, is there anything that you can do to help them all get into a good mental state? Like if you notice that people aren't quite ready for the learning experience or don't want to be there or upset about something, like what do you do to manage that?
So I think you manage it for a start by starting really, really early. So you're persuading people that they want to come and they want to learn. So you're not sending out, here's a mandatory training thing you must attend, because that just already puts people's backs up, gives them a sense of fear. So you start before the training happens. You then set up your learning environment, and that's exactly the same whether it's virtual or whether it's face-to-face, but you set up your environment so that it's friendly, so that it's agreeable, so that people feel comfortable in it. So you need to spend time for people to get to know each other and get to know, the trainer, whoever the trainer may be. So you need to have, and I know you do a lot of e-learning and things. Even within an e-learning environment, people need to feel comfortable with the environment before they can start working with the learning, the knowledge or the skills they're going to have to learn. So there's a huge amount you can do. And if you see a group is struggling for some reason, you have to do something about it. Sometimes it's really simple things like, the room's too hot, the room's too cold, they might be hungry, they might be tired. There's really basic primitive human things that we need to address first before we try and start getting into the learning. People need water, they need fresh air. So all those things are really important to sort of start people feeling like they want to learn.
I love that. I feel like that's great because I think sometimes we can try to get people to learn a whole heap of content and just say, we've got this amount of time, let's get you through all of this. But it sounds like it is really important to get them into a state where they're ready to take in those learnings, whether that's taking a break or, like you said, like the room's too hot. Like I don't think I would always think of things like that. So that's really interesting to think about things like that, because it can have an impact on how we take in information.
And also just how the room is set up. So, your classic rows of desks really put people off, because that just takes them back to school, which for most people was not their best learning experience. But even things like the classic horseshoe of tables, that's not great for learning, because you're actually separating people out from each other. You're distancing them from each other. And okay, right now we're all supposed to be distanced, but on the whole,
mandatory.
On the whole, we are social creatures and we like to connect, and it helps people if they are in an environment where they feel much more socially connected. So just the way you lay out your room can have a massive impact. We always, we do quite a lot of work when we're thinking about physical training. We do quite a lot of work to make sure that we've got light environments, we've got temperature is right, that the people are fed before they arrive, or fed out as they arrive. It's kind of food that is nutritious as opposed to being, loads of sticky cakes and biscuits. So that kind of environmental impact is massively important, and that translates through to virtual too.
I was about to say, how do you do that in a virtual environment? Like if you're running a workshop virtually, which is going to be happening a lot for people now, how do you achieve that in that environment?
So yesterday we were running our first cybersecurity foundations program, And one of the things we do, we have quite a lot of prep work for people to do beforehand, which is part of the learning. They do a lot of kind of exploration of content and things before they come. But also we say, right, so you're going to be sitting in a webinar. Make sure you've got access to a drink. If you need a snack, then have it handy, have it with you. Halfway through, we encourage people to go and take 5 minutes break, whatever you need a break for. If we can, we encourage them to stand up quite often. So we might even ask them to move away from the computer and go and do something. Shorter sessions, we would never do anything like that for more than about 90 minutes, and then we send people off.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we actually say to them, look, make sure you go and get some fresh air and make sure you feed yourself. Don't just dive into your computer and be working online, because that's not giving you that break you need.
Yeah, I love that. Something else that I was really curious about is novelty. I know you speak about incorporating novelty into learning to engage learners. What's some ways that you can do that?
Oh, interesting. Well, for some people, just seeing a room that isn't a row of tables or a horseshoe of chairs is already novel.
Yeah, something different.
There's a balance. You've got to get that kind of state of people feeling comfortable and safe, but then the novelty helps them remember.
Yeah.
So anything you can do that's different. So you might introduce, one of the things I sometimes do is actually to sort of switch the room around. So people expect the PowerPoint, if you've got a PowerPoint, to be at the front of the room. I would sometimes have that at the side of the room, for instance, so that, it's kind of, oh, that's different to normal. So the way you set your room up can be different. Getting people to participate in kind of very different kind of exercises. So one of the things we do on our brain-friendly training programs, we get people to physically build a brain, but they're actually people being parts of brains, and they absolutely love it.
Cool. Yeah.
Because that's not a way they've ever discovered brain science before, that they actually become part of a brain. So getting people to physically act out models, processes, that's another really good way.
It sounds like it's almost like stimulating the different parts of the brain, like allowing it to use different parts. Is that right? To help you learn things and remember things?
Yeah, because if you think about, our natural way of learning, we haven't evolved to learn by, we haven't even evolved to learn by reading books. I mean, I love reading books, but it's not necessarily learning.
Yeah.
We haven't evolved to do that. We've evolved to learn by experiencing, by reflecting, by doing, by practicing. That's the natural way of learning, and by moving. Humans didn't sit down until quite a long way into their evolution. So sitting down isn't really a natural way of learning. Actually physically doing, moving around, and being social, because we are very, very social as well.
Yeah, nice. And what about with giving learners too much? So almost like brain, because I know you can have cognitive overload, where your brain's just like, oh, it's too much, I can't take in anymore. Tell me a little bit about that.
So I think you can have all sorts of different overloads. So there's cognitive overload, there's emotional overload, and sensory overload.
Oh, interesting. Well. Okay.
Yeah, you can get that. And this is a reflection, a useful reflection for me. So for me, I like an environment that's very multisensory for people. But I have had people at the end of a day with us say, actually, I felt quite overwhelmed because there was so much going on. Okay. So not necessarily all cognitive, but there was a lot of sensory material. And they say that, they felt there was so much going on that they were needing to reflect. So for me, that happened quite early in my career with one particular person. So yeah. I realized that you need to give people time to move away from all that sensory overload.
Yeah.
So what was cognitive overload you asked about. Just excuse me, my head.
There's so many different
Can you hear that music? Can you hear the music?
No, I can't.
Okay, well that's all right. It's probably not going to disturb everybody then.
Oh, okay, no. Have you got someone playing music, a neighbour or something?
Yeah, my husband is playing music.
Oh, that's awesome. Just adds to the vibe. Okay. I can't hear it.
Okay, we'll go with it. It's not too bad at the moment. Yeah. If he puts on death metal, then we'll turn him down.
Oh, I love it.
Cognitive overload. Yes, you're asking about cognitive overload. So cognitive overload is when, our brains just can't take in any more information. They overload. And there's lots of ways that can happen. It can happen quite quickly. So if I were to ask you to I can give you a test of cognitive overload.
Oh no, putting me under pressure.
And I'm not going to make you do it for a long time.
Okay.
But tell me the months of the year alphabetically.
April, August, December.
And I don't know them off by heart, so I'm sure you're doing. But that feeling of, oh my goodness,
yeah, that's hard.
Hold one lot of things in my brain, which, you know, I could do the months. That's really easy, isn't it? And then I've got to transfer that into some other way of thinking. I've got to create a separate list in my brain. That's an example of cognitive overload. That sounds like a really simple thing to do, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's almost like I was like trying to imagine all the months and then sort through them, but then I'd forgotten what one of them was. And yeah, that is cognitive overload. You're right.
So that's one example. And the other thing we do is we just fire lots and lots and lots of information at people, and we think by giving people information, they're learning. A, information isn't learning, and B, we can only process limited amounts of information. Our brains, whilst they're hugely flexible, and we can learn brilliantly well, and we can process billions and billions of bits of information really rapidly. They aren't infinite. We need to give them time to brains are full of electricity and they're full of chemicals. All those electrical connections are happening all the time, but they actually need time to recover. One neuron connecting with another neuron and sending an electrical connection actually needs time to recover after that neuron has fired. So that multiplies up multiple times, obviously. But we can't just keep throwing stuff at them. They need time to process, to reflect, and to embed. And learning doesn't happen just by giving people information.
That was actually one of my questions I was interested in, turning learning into a habit. So how does the brain, like what you're saying, how does it get a piece of information and then, with the neurons firing, create a habit so they actually do it on almost autopilot, I guess? Like it just becomes natural. I feel like that would be hard to do. How do you achieve that?
Can't even say the word repetition. Lots and lots of repetition. But you're not like, a piece of information doesn't necessarily become a habit. I guess a habit, you could learn to connect two pieces of information. That might be a habit. So if you think January, you immediately think February, for instance.
Yeah.
That's a sort of, I guess that's a habitual way of thinking, isn't it? That's a connection. And that is literally by repeating it over and over again. You've never, as a child, you would learn the months of the year, for instance. You'd repeat them over and over again. You see them many, many times repeated. And that's why it becomes a habit, because they're always repeated in the same order. So it's that kind of regularity. And basically you've got, neurons. I mean, this is really, really simplistic. And I am not a neuroscientist. I've studied it, but I am not a neuroscientist myself. So I'm going to give you a fairly simple explanation. But if you think about it, two neurons connect together to form a new idea, a new connection in some way. And that first connection is actually quite wobbly. It's quite loose. It's quite not secure. But what happens if they come together again? Then this kind of myelin sheath, it's like a little fatty sort of substance, begins to start forming around them. There's a phrase you might have heard it: brains that fire together, wire together. And that's about saying that with repeated encounters, there is a higher potential for those two neurons to connect together. And as it goes over and over and over and over again, as you repeat multiple times, that potential to connect becomes stronger until eventually they are effectively wired together. They say that it's actually very hard once you've got a habit to completely break a habit, because those neurons will always have an attraction to each other.
Wow. So how do you design learning so that repetition can happen?
I design it so the learner repeats rather than the trainer, for a start.
So do they?
So the way we design training is we start before people think they're coming to training. So we give, so you start, everybody before they get involved in training starts thinking about what they need to learn, But we do quite a lot of pre-work before the event, whatever the event might be, so that you're beginning to introduce people to concepts, you're beginning to introduce them to understand why they might want to do this learning, why that might be important to them, so get some of that motivation stuff going, and sending them, so you're not asking them to learn something immediately, but you're introducing them to new ideas, new concepts, whatever it might be. Then when you're when the training is happening, they're sort of officially starting, is perhaps the way of saying it, then you want people to have multi-sensory experiences of what's going on, so that they're able to make multiple connections in the future.
Yeah.
So if you just learn something just through one sensory modality, then you've only ever got one way to access that later on. But if you have different ways, I can remember what that smelled like, and I can remember what that sounded like, and I can remember what that felt like, and I can remember what I saw. You've now got different hooks, different ways of getting into that learning, haven't you? So making it multisensory is important, and getting people to explore the learning for themselves. One of the things I think is really, really important is at the start of a session is asking people, what do you already know? Because then they can build on what they already know. Whereas if you just start throwing new stuff at them, it's like, oh my God, I don't know what this is. But if they already think, oh yeah, well, I already know how to say the months of the year, for instance, whatever it might be, or I already know how to we've been teaching cybersecurity. I already know some things about cybersecurity because as a person using a computer, everybody knows a little bit about cybersecurity.
Yeah.
What do they already know, and then can build on that. So that's another really important thing. And then there's lots and lots of ways you need to repeat, but obviously not just over and over again the same thing.
Yeah.
But get them to do different exercises, get them to do practice, get them to do tests. Testing is a really good way to get people to recall what they know, or to re-practice what they are learning. And then you need to take it over time. So one of the times when our brain actually processes the learning is when we're sleeping. So sleep is really, really important to learn. Yeah, because that's when the consolidation of memory begins to happen.
Interesting. I can actually relate to that. I feel like if I'm working on something at night and it gets difficult and I can't understand it, if I sleep and get up early and look at it, it's easy. I've looked at it so much the night before, now I get it. So I can see how.
And that's probably partly because the night before you were beginning to feel tired, so you probably overloaded your brain. It wasn't ready to take in any more.
Cognitive overload.
But then as you slept, your brain was actually, tends to happen, I mean, again, this is simplistic, but what tends to happen is during the day, your brain is being bombarded by lots and lots of information. That information goes into your hippocampus, which is the memory sorting center.
Yeah.
And but at night, so say for instance an image comes into your brain, your image comes in through your eyes, goes to your visual cortex, and part of it goes off to your hippocampus. So you've got this kind of visual thing floating around. At night, what happens is your hippocampus processes that image and puts it back into your visual cortex. So it kind of puts it back where it came from, but it's like a second time of it being there. So that makes it a stronger memory.
Interesting. That's so cool. Brain is so interesting.
It is, it's fascinating. But you don't necessarily need, like I said before, you don't necessarily need to be a neuroscientist to be a really good trainer. A lot of things really good trainers and good designers do. Yeah. They've kind of evolved and they've learned from experience or good teaching themselves. You don't need to know it, but it does help you tweak things if you understand something about why. So, understanding that sleep is important for learning. Yeah. I think it's really good to have training programs that actually go over time. So not just try and cram everything into one day, but actually give people time to consolidate bits of learning over time.
Yeah, love it. So on that,
trying to sleep.
Let's say that you had, I would love to know what the ultimate, absolute best training solution would be, taking into account neuroscience. If you had limitless budget, all the resources that you wanted in the world, what would that training solution look like? Like blue skies, neuroscience, amazing. What would you do?
I guess the first question would just be to say, but what are you trying to learn? So, you know, are you trying to learn some knowledge? Are you trying to learn a skill, a behavior, a habit? So I think you'd have to identify that first, because there's probably some differences.
Yeah.
But I suppose if I mean, that's such a lovely question, really. If you had everything. I think you would start with getting the person really highly motivated, understanding really why they want to learn this. What is it for them? Yes. So perhaps it would be, so try, a really, really in-depth conversation to find out what excites them and what motivates them and all that sort of thing. So you really, really do that analysis. And because most training is related to work, isn't it? What's the organization's goal? So you're actually tying that in as well, so that it's not just the learner, but the context in which they are.
Yeah.
And then you would try and create an environment where it was going to be really easy for them to learn. And that would be not just a training environment, but that would be the organizational culture as well, so that they had, their manager was completely bought into helping them, support them, and they'd have a coach and they'd have a mentor and they'd have peers who were helping them and all sorts of other yes, please, a coffee. Sorry.
Coffee time. Too late for a coffee in Australia. I won't sleep tonight.
Yeah. Oh yes, you don't want to stop. So you'd have lots of opportunity for people to get their own understanding first.
Yeah.
And then you would be supporting them in stretching them to take that understanding further. So exposing them to new ideas, novel ideas, but giving them multiple ways to do that.
Yeah.
I guess you would stretch it over time so that, it wasn't just one opportunity to do it. And then lots and lots of opportunity back in the workplace
love that.
To practice and to get fantastic feedback. The feedback they really need, not the feedback that sometimes people want to give them. Loads and loads of feedback, more opportunities to stretch and to try new things.
Yeah.
And stretch it out over a really long period of time. Well, or as long, depends what it is, but to give them more opportunity to learn.
For repetition and time to get it into their memory so that it sort of stays. It doesn't just because I think I read a statistic, it might have been in your course, something around the percentage of learning that we actually take in after it. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's like after a day of learning, we actually don't remember much of it. It's like.
So are you thinking of sort of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, maybe?
Could be, yeah.
So
maybe.
So that's a really, really, really old psychological study. It's probably one of the early, and it's really, really well known. But Hermann Ebbinghaus was an early psychologist, and he was basically testing his learning. But he wasn't testing contextual learning, relevant world-based learning. He was testing how well he could learn random strings of letters. So quite a hard thing to learn.
Yeah.
There's no context to that, is there? Why would you want to do that apart from an experiment?
It's a bit random, isn't it?
But what he found was if he didn't practice, repeat, go over it and over it again, if he just kind of read the random strings of letters, then he found that he recalled very little afterwards.
Okay.
So you can see his forgetting curve, and it's after about a day, he's only remembering about 20% of what he'd learned.
Yeah.
And that is it's a really useful statistic, and it's a really useful tool, but it's not like a lot of neuroscience and psychology experiments. It's not actually real world.
Yeah.
But I'm quite sure we've all experienced going to a lecture or a presentation where somebody tells you a lot of stuff, and you think, oh yeah, that's really interesting, I'm really going to remember that. And then you go from that lecture or presentation, and you pick up your computer, you answer all your emails, you have a meeting, you go home, you watch the telly, and then you're thinking in the evening, what did I learn at that lecture? Because all you've done is you encountered that information, but then you've just replaced it with lots of other experiences. So you haven't had time to consolidate it. So I think that's, it's sort of the Herming-Ebbinghaus curve helps, but it's not entirely relevant, but I think it does explain the experience that we all have.
So I'm thinking, is there anything that supervisors can do to support their staff in that repetition, like questions they could ask, or is that something that you do in your learning initiatives? I'm just thinking of ways that learners can be sort of kept accountable to do that repetition and keep it in their brain.
So, I mean, there's for years and years, people have said that the manager, your supervisor, is absolutely key and vital to your learning. And I think that's true, because if I was once sent on an Oracle database course. Before I went, my manager told me nothing about why I was going. And when I came back, I had nothing to apply it to. So surprise, surprise, it was a 2-week course. I know nothing about Oracle databases. I couldn't tell you anything. If my manager before I'd went and said, right, I'm going to ask you to go to this Oracle database course, perhaps they'd give me something to think about before I went to that course, and then perhaps given me some real inspiration as to why I might want to do it, perhaps told me about a project I was going to get involved in. Then when I came back from the course, I was immediately immersed in this project, and then they were there helping me and supporting me. I probably would have learned quite a lot about Oracle databases.
Yeah.
So it's the environment, I think, you leave, and that because training often happens outside of the work environment, the context is different, and it's that context that is vital to learning, that managers can really, really, really support, but don't necessarily know what the right thing to do is, or don't necessarily have the time to do it. Yeah. So one of my sort of bee in my bonnet is, I think we should help learners understand their own learning processes and recognize that, okay, my manager hasn't necessarily got time to help me, but how can I help myself? What can I do for myself to set myself up to be ready to learn? And what can I do afterwards to support my learning? So a lot of times people talk about, I think people often confuse content with learning. And content is just content. Content is just, it's just there. You can learn from it, but it's not the learning process. And I think, sorry, you asked me about managers, weren't you, and supervisors?
No, this is good. I feel like you have so much value and knowledge. I'm just like, oh my gosh.
I feel like I'm leaping from one thing to another.
No, it's good.
One of the other things I was thinking was that, actually learning often happens in the context of work. Learning that can happen in the context of work is really vital, which is why coaching can be really, and I don't mean sit down and have a coaching session, but I mean, genuine managers asking really good coaching questions. So instead of you saying to your manager, how do I do this? They say, okay, well, what do you already know about doing this? What have you seen other people do that do this? What have you tried before? What has been similar to doing this, whatever it is? So I think that's where managers can play a real role in terms of helping people within the context of work, and providing, job aids and things that help them, so that you're not always having to think or to look, but if you just, sometimes just having a list of tasks you need to follow is actually a really good way to learn it, because you've got the list, you can do the task, and then you can go back to the list, and the next time you probably don't read everything on the list because you've turned some of it into habit. So really simple things like that can be really useful.
Yeah, love it. This is amazing. You're amazing, Stella. Is there anything else that you would like to add about neuroscience? Any advice for people out there applying it to their learning?
I think don't get too hung up on it, because and there will be people who will criticize you for using neuroscience. So there are people now who are saying, well, we don't know enough about neuroscience to actually say we can use it in training. And it's to some degree, I agree with them, because a lot of the pure neuroscience is done in laboratories, on people, in, scanners, not doing realistic work-based, learning-based activities. Whereas for most of us, we're learning in the real world. My belief is the more we understand about the brain and how it works, and the more we get interested in it, and the more we begin to apply what we do know and what we can sensibly deduct from research, then the better our training is going to be, because we've got an evidence base for it. But that evidence base doesn't always come from the pure neuroscience. It comes from psychology experiments, again, which are often just really weird. They're not real work-based activity.
Some of them are random. Yeah,
they're very random, some of them. But you can deduce things from it, and observation of what really happens in the real world. But one of the challenges I think that we as humans have is we're hugely flawed in our ability to perceive things. So we tend to think that just because I'm just getting a coffee now. This is really live, isn't it?
You gotta have your coffee. Coffee is life. Can't do it without coffee.
Where was I going with that one?
You were talking about just learning about it. So just understanding about it and knowing about it can really help you. And people are going to criticize, but you just need to start.
Yeah, I think we need to, I think it's useful for us as L&D professionals to begin to understand and to begin to recognize what the evidence says. I was talking about perception, wasn't I? Our perception is, we sometimes think things seem common sense, or that we feel they're right when they're not necessarily right. There isn't any evidence to prove it. Learning styles was a great example. Everybody thought, oh yes, that sounds like a lovely idea, doesn't it? But there's no evidence to prove that learning styles have any validity at all. Yes, we need multisensory input, but we don't have, some people needing one type and some people needing another. All of us learn well from visual input, so visual is really important. But we all learn from multiply sensory input. So I think it's about beginning to question what's good methodology, what's good practice, and that scientific kind of principle helps you do that, so that you're able to sort of say, well, where did this model come from? Where did this theory come from? Is there some sound evidence behind it, or is it something that somebody just, and when I say invented, I don't mean they invented it maliciously or to be foolish, but they just based it on their own experience, and experience is valuable, but it's not sufficient.
So where do you find those resources and models, and how do you get access to all of these amazing things?
Partly through my own networks now, because you grow networks, don't you? So I work with other people who are also really interested in this sort of thing. I do loads of reading for myself. I did a psychology degree, so I already had a science background, so I kind of, that makes it
have
easier.
That interest.
I tend not to read really, really deep science papers unless I really, really get fascinated by something, because they're not generally related to the learning world. So so there's some really good resources you can get, and I'm less familiar with the Australian resources, but there's a paper called Neuroscience News which comes out regularly, has some interesting articles. British Research Digest, British Psychology Society Research Digest, other people's books. So there's some fantastic books out there that are really, really good. Conferences, there are some nice conferences out there in terms of learning and evidence-based stuff. So I'm kind of a bit of a magpie. I collect things from different places. And at the moment, actually, we're actually going to do some genuine research. So my new company, Stella Labs, we're actually doing some research with the University of Antwerp. Looking at it's really looking at the feedback people get and what feedback is going to help them build their learning better. So not just feedback in terms of what do people tell them about how well they're doing, but we've got a platform, so we'll be collecting data and kind of understanding how they does telling them they're doing really well help, or does telling them where they've made errors help. So we're going to use the data as well as, so we're going to use analytical, objective data, but also subjective data. So, does feedback, very specific feedback from their mentor, because we use mentors, help them? Peer feedback, how does that help them? So we're really looking at all the different aspects of feedback and how that helps to support the learning journey from kind of beginning to end, with a view to helping them be successful at the end. A lot of time learning happens, and if you think of university courses or school courses, you do a lot of learning, and then at the end there's a test, but that test is they're not wanting you to fail the test as such, but it's trying to see whether you've captured all the key points. But what we want to do is use feedback as they go through, so that by the time they get to an assessment at the end, the assessment will test everything they're doing, but by that time everything should be really, really well embedded. So they're not having to swat and revise right at the end of the test, because they should have learned it, that we've got this sort of building blocks embedded, and they keep learning, so you learn 3 key principles at the beginning, for instance, and then you keep building on those. So by the end, those 3 key principles have become just completely embedded, and they're just things you do without thinking, effectively.
Second nature almost.
But then you've built on it as you've gone through. So yes, that's going to be some really interesting.
Very exciting. Well, I know you do a lot. Like, I did your neuroscience course on LinkedIn and I loved it. Like, it was
good.
So interesting. I was like, I feel like I'm learning so much. So for our audience watching today, I really recommend that you check out Stella. She has amazing things around neuroscience. Your book is on my list that I want to read. So did you just want to share with the audience what resources you have out there so they can find what you're doing and read more about you? And I can put it in the description of the video.
So I have got the book there.
Awesome.
Actually, because I quite often have to look at it myself, because
I love it. Very pretty.
You don't actually remember everything that's in it. So it's Neuroscience for Learning and Development.
That's
I've also got a book on webinars, so the webinar pocketbook that I co-wrote with Andy Lancaster.
Okay.
It's not a book based on neuroscience, but we do introduce the idea of how to do a brain-friendly webinar. But it's very, very practical. Because for me, being practical is really, really important. It's not just the neuroscience, the practical application of it is the most important part of it.
Love it.
I have a blog. So I have my old blog, which is stellalearning.co.uk, but also we have a new blog and podcasts at stellarlabs.eu.
Yeah.
And we're going to be producing lots more. So we're doing some interesting podcasts. Actually, I'll have to interview you, Hannah.
Yeah.
The blog, the podcast.
That'll be awesome. And
we will
course as well. Your LinkedIn course. It's called what's the name of it?
It's called Using Neuroscience in Learning and Development, I think. That's on LinkedIn Learning.
So many things.
And we're running, if people come to visit our stellarlabs.eu website, we're running various open programs, a lot of which currently are digital, obviously.
Yeah.
So we're doing one on conscious learning starting in May.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you so much, Stella. You have been so amazing today, and I feel like I've learnt so much from you, and I know that our community will be really grateful as well. So yeah, thank you.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Hannah. Thank you. And apologies for the distractions.
Oh, you got to have your coffee. It's just something you got to have. I'm jealous.
Coffee.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the show, Stella. Anyone who's watching, please share with anyone who will find this valuable, which I know so many people will. I think neuroscience does have a really good place in learning and development, and Stella just shares great content on it. So check it out, and thanks everyone for listening.